Right, good morning, everyone. A warm welcome from the Marron Institute of Urban Management, which is a think, do tank at New York University. I'm Angela Hawken, the director of the Institute. We're so pleased you're joining us today. This is the fourth in the Anatomy of Density webinar series led by Dr. Solly Angel. Today's webinar focuses on a pressing issue in our own backyard, New York City's housing affordability crisis. An important feature of the city's crisis is its supply side. There's simply not enough room, that is affordable room, to accommodate the people who live and work here, not to mention the added population that wants to come here because it's the most productive city in the country. Making adequate room in our city, which is already fully built, can only be done through densification of its existing footprint. The challenge for New York City is how to densify itself by creating very large numbers of truly affordable housing units throughout the city, but without displacing existing residents and without changing the character of existing neighborhoods. This, as it turns out, is not so simple. And it'll definitely be a central challenge for New York City's next mayor to be elected this coming November. The primaries are scheduled for the 22nd of June. That's just 2 weeks from now. Addressing this issue of affordability and making room is more than just tacking on some mandated affordable units to luxury towers built in a few desirable locations. So for this webinar, the Marron Institute has brought together some of the best minds in the field, a group of people who have concrete ideas on how this can be done and what the city's next mayor needs to hear and to do to make it happen and make it happen soon. In terms of logistics for the session, please use the Q&A function to ask any questions. We'll get to as many of your questions as possible during the session, but all the questions along to as well as answers to all of them will be distributed to everyone who's registered today. We also wanted to let you know that the session today is being recorded. During the session, we'll be posting a link to sign up to our Marron Institute's newsletter and to follow us on Twitter. If you aren't already on our distribution list, this is a good way to stay informed about the work of the urban expansion team and our other programming at Marron, and also to receive notice of our future events. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Professor of Urban Planning and the Director of the Marron Institute's Urban Expansion Program, Dr. Solly Angel. Thank you, Solly.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone abroad. I'm Solly Angel. I'm very happy to welcome you to this fourth webinar where we discuss densification options for New York City. There will be 5 panelists today who will make presentations after my short introduction. Jessica Katz, the Executive Director of the Citizen Housing Planning Council, Professor Rick Hills from the NYU Law School, Sean Campion from the Citizen Budget Commission, Barika Williams, the Executive Director of the Association of Neighborhood and Housing Development, and Henry Graybar, a staff writer for Slate. The discussant will be the Senior Research Associate Alain Berthaud from the Marron Institute. Let me give an introductory framework for this. This is the fourth webinar on the Anatomy of Density series. The Anatomy of Density idea, and I would share the screen with you, was the idea that density can actually be decomposed into several elements. So if we see urban density as people per the urban footprint, we can actually break it down to several components, which you can see in the bottom row of that slide. And when we multiply these components by each other, sorry, I can't get the next slide. Hold on. Oh, that way. When we multiply these components by each other, we get urban density. So what we see is that urban density is actually the product of 7 factors, and each one of these factors can be manipulated to densify the city. So the first one that you can see here is dwelling unit occupancy. That means how many people live in an individual dwelling unit. That number can be increased by encouraging multi-generational living, by encouraging people to have more children, by encouraging people to live together in communal living arrangement, or by encouraging residential mobility, allowing older people with larger apartments to move to smaller apartments. Another factor is the occupancy rate. If there are a lot of units and they're empty, it doesn't add to density. So the idea is to fill them in. And there are 250,000 vacant apartments in New York City that are vacant for one reason or the other. One suggestion is to introduce a vacancy tax, to permit leasing of vacant homes, to overcome reluctance to rent vacant units, to avoid supply of units not in demand, and to reverse the abandonment of units in the central city. All of those things can increase density by increasing the occupancy rate. We can increase dwelling unit packing, namely the size, reducing the size of dwelling units. We can allow the subdivision of dwelling units. You can see a subdivision here on the bottom left in Hong Kong of 2 apartments into 8. We can remove minimum size of apartments. We can eliminate lending bias against condominiums. And we can avoid displacement of poor people to replace them with rich ones that have much larger apartments. Here's an example of a rooming house in San Francisco in 1907. Single rooms all have windows. Just an interesting example of packing people in. We can increase floor plan efficiency by better architecture for high-rise buildings that uses more of the floor area for units, encouraging lightweight construction, improving building design, and reducing parking requirements, which make floor plans much less efficient. We can, of course, increase building height by relaxing building height restrictions, by adding floors to existing roofs. You can see that an example in Israel, before and after, buildings that had more floors added to it. We can increase access to construction finance so that people can add additional accessory dwelling units to their homes, increase allowable FARs, or expand zoning for multifamily buildings, which is what Oregon has done and what Minneapolis has done lately. We can allow increases in plot coverage by reducing minimum plot size for single families, relaxing setback regulations, allowing multiple units on single family plots, and increasing the allowable FAR. We can also finally increase the residential share of land use in the city by accelerating conversion to residential land use, by encouraging mixed use, by avoiding mass evictions for urban highways, by avoiding over-allocation of lands for industry, and by introducing a vacant land tax. All of these elements allow us, give us options to discuss of how we can densify the cities. At this point, I will just stop sharing and just give you an idea of the variety of things that can be done. And I will now talk to people, allow people to talk to the people who are on the ground trying to solve this problem in our city. I start with Jessica Katz. She's the executive director of the Citizens Housing Planning Council, the CHPC, that in December 2020 issued the policy brief titled Basement and Cellars Regulatory Reform. Jessica joined CHPC from New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, where she most recently served as the Associate Commissioner for New Construction. Jessica, welcome.
Thank you so much, Sally. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for everyone in the audience for keeping with us on this Zoom, which hopefully we'll be doing these events in person very, very soon. And my name is Jessica. I'm the Executive Director of the Citizens Housing and Planning Council. We're a policy research and advocacy organization started in the 1930s. So there's a few aspects of density that I want to touch on today. I think the first is, if we're going to start talking about anytime you talk about introducing more density into New York City, there's a variety of different pushback on that. Most recently, and a topic that CHPC has done a lot of work on, there's a fear that density is literally dangerous to our health. So this is something that's going to be really, this is a myth mostly, but it's a myth that's going to be pretty dangerous to New York City. It was very dangerous across the country. So I want to talk a little bit about our research around density and the spread of COVID. So I think the beginning of the pandemic, particularly when New York City was its epicenter last spring, it brought up a lot of reminders for people of these really age-old xenophobic myths about cities, about how dirty and unhealthy and crowded they are, and how dirty and unhealthy and crowded their people are. So that's something that was kind of at a myth that America has about its cities that was at the ready when the pandemic began, and really gained a lot of steam because early COVID cases did cluster in New York City. But even at that time, the research that we did was from May of last year. Population density was not correlated with a higher COVID rate. So even when we were the epicenter, there were many, many global cities that are much, much higher density that had much lower rates of COVID. The suburbs of New York City had higher rates of COVID than New York City itself. There were many rural and suburban areas, even last spring, that had much higher densities, had much higher rates of COVID than we did. We saw terrible rates in Tennessee. We saw terrible rates in South Dakota. And that was even when we continued to be the epicenter. And within New York City neighborhoods, there was no correlation between population density and COVID rates. So in fact, it was somewhat opposite. And that's because the real driver of COVID is crowding, racism, access to healthcare. There was all kinds of other factors that did drive it, but that people are kind of able to use density and kind of urbanity itself as sort of a shorthand for those things in a way that was really damaging to New York City. Frankly, I think it kept kind of suburban and rural America last spring feeling safer because they felt like this was a New York City problem. And I think a lot of people across the country, frankly, got sick and died because they had this myth that this was a problem for New York City. It continues to be a problem for New York City because people start worrying that our recovery is sort of contingent and that it's somewhat accidental. So I really think that continuing to keep it out there, the suggestion that like, oh, it must be safer in Montana, all those people in New York, you still hear that in a sort of flippant way. And the data just does not bear that out. And it's going to have a huge impact for New York City's recovery as a whole, and certainly for any conversations around continued densification of New York City. So that's one aspect that I want to touch on. CHBC also for many years, among many other activists and great groups in New York City, have done research around basement apartment conversions. So there's a conversation around accessory dwelling units, granny flats, backyards, sheds, converted to housing across the country. In New York City, the most clear application for an accessory dwelling unit tends to be in a basement apartment, but the regulations surrounding creating a legal safe unit in a basement space in New York City are so complicated that it really stymies any well-meaning homeowner who's trying to work through that process. So we have window regulations, ceiling height regulations, egress regulations. So all these regs are created for, a large private developer with lots of resources and lots of lawyers to help figure out. They're not designed for a low-income homeowner to even know how to ask the question of, is this apartment legal? Can I make it legal? How much would it cost to do that? So the regulations themselves are a huge barrier. When I first started at CHPC and looked at our basements work, I had this dream of sort of a quick homeowner checklist that we would provide to say, hey, here's a tape measure your window, measure your door, measure your bedroom, and then we can tell you, green, red, yellow, how likely it is that you'll be able to convert. And we ended up with a spreadsheet that's like 30 pages long of all the different regulations and how they interact with each other. It's just not feasible for an individual homeowner to try to work that out. And many of the basement regulations contradict each other, and it can be very difficult to figure out. So all the land use attorneys on my board will sit together and we'll spend hours trying to figure out one of these little regulations, what the intention was. So we put out a report that was some of the regulatory reforms that we think are necessary. There was a pilot that was done in East New York that we thought was a great start in terms of picking 40 basement buildings with basements to try to convert them legally. It was not nearly enough. And early findings from that research shows that the regulatory reforms in that pilot didn't go far enough. So we have a variety of regulatory reforms that we're recommending for the purpose of making the basement safer. Because what happens is people are living in basements, whether we like it or not, and lacking a pathway to make them safe and legal does not prevent people from living in them. And it compromises their safety rather than promoting their safety. So we've kind of stayed away from the term legalizing basement apartments. That sort of suggests that we're legalizing something that's bad. But in fact, the lack of legalization is what's making it dangerous, analogous to some of the other legalization discussions we're having in our culture today. The last thing I'll just talk about is, I think that as a city, we've maybe not done the best job of making an argument for density as a climate resiliency measure. So I think we're going to have to have some really hard conversations in New York City and across the country and around the world about what we're willing to do in order to combat climate change. And I think the conversation around limiting suburban sprawl and increasing density in areas that can absorb it, I think is something that we've not made that connection between density and climate change, certainly not in New York City. So I think that's a conversation that is yet to be had. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take any other questions. Excited to hear what our other panelists have to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. I will now go to our second speaker, Professor Roderick Hills. He's a professor of law at the New York University School of Law, and he's a co-author with David Schleicher of Planning an Affordable City and Can Planning Deregulate Land Use? He's also a co-author of a book titled Land Use Controls, Cases and Materials. Rick, the floor is yours.
Hi there. Thanks, Solly. Great panel and great concept of thinking about density in different dimensions. Here's some basic points I want to talk about really quickly. The overarching narrative will be that I think density faces an enormous political battle, an uphill battle. There are two strategies for increasing density in housing, and there's bad news and good news for those strategies. And what I want to talk about quickly is the failure of one strategy, which I'm going to call the pitched battle strategy, and the promise of a more granular, I call it citywide guerrilla warfare, symbolized by something called zoning for quality and affordability. But I want to caution that both strategies face a gigantic uphill battle because of a dominant political narrative in New York City that makes all reform of zoning in New York City extraordinarily difficult. So here's one strategy for fixing New York City's housing shortage. And let me emphasize, New York City has had 10,000 permits per year, new permits of dwelling units per year for the last decade. That is a tiny number, given the number of people flowing into New York City. We suffer from housing starvation that is actually greater than San Francisco. So the number of units produced in New York City will not cover the number of people who are coming here or being born here. So we face a displacement crisis, a supply-driven displacement crisis. Now, one solution to that is to pick out some target parcel that you think will be politically feasible for rezoning. This solution uses the map amendment. And in the Bloomberg administration, what you do is pick out a target parcel for, say, manufacturing on the coast of, Astoria or Brooklyn. And the idea is there's not too many nearby neighbors. And so you don't have to face the kind of NIMBYism, the not in my backyard attitudes that normally doom zoning reform. And Bloomberg produced some housing through that strategy, but not nearly enough to keep up with the supply needs. Those lots have largely been rezoned. The manufacturing lots, the sort of riverside manufacturing lots where you get a big condo unit have been rezoned. And the price of that was a sort of shrink wrapping of the rest of the city. Bloomberg bought those rezonings, in Williamsburg by essentially shrink wrapping Boerum Hill, Carroll Gardens, Sunset Park with what is known as contextual zoning. By shrink wrapping, I mean that the built units that are there are the only things that you can build. You can't build above them. The soft sites where you might put a few extra stories, forget about it. So that's been enormously costly. Now, de Blasio has tried the strategy of what's known as mandatory inclusionary housing, where you essentially buy support for more housing by guaranteeing a certain percentage of affordable units. And the guarantee is supposed to be rock solid. That, I think, Eric Kober has convincingly shown to be a losing strategy, and it produced about 2,000 units. And the reason is the bribe didn't work. The zonings in East New York, in Sunnyside, in Inwood fell, and desperately needed housing was destroyed. There's a third strategy that's being used, and it's the same kind of pitched battle strategy where you pick a particular parcel and you decide to rezone it for a significant number of units. And this is the idea of going into an affluent neighborhood and saying, look, there can't possibly be a worry about displacement in this neighborhood because everybody here is rich. There is not going to be any displacement of poor people in Soho and NoHo because the number of poor people in Soho and NoHo is minuscule. The neighborhood's long been gentrified. And of course, you'll get opposition like this. You get opposition largely from white, affluent condo owners who don't like new housing. But what's really shocking is you get opposition like this. Many anti-gentrification folks have been mobilizing against NoHo and Soho, not all of them, but even the pro-housing groups like Fifth Avenue Committee who fought for the Gowanus rezoning are not showing up in NoHo Soho. And so you're not getting a lot of advocates of affordable housing or opponents of gentrification to say, we need to build market rate housing and affordable housing in Soho or NoHo, because otherwise the people who would occupy those units will flood out across the city and bid up units in Inwood. There is no constituency for that. So the pitched battle strategy has been a failure. And I think we need to acknowledge that. It takes years. It creates extraordinary political acrimony, and it usually can be vetoed by a single recalcitrant council member. So, what is the other strategy that's available? Well, I call it a more granular city-wide strategy. And rather than using a map amendment to the zoning map, it uses a text amendment. So it applies to the entire city. And the model for this is zoning for quality and affordability. Now, I want to give you an example of the kind of opposition to even incremental increases of density that you wouldn't think would spark opposition as a background to why I think a citywide text amendment is more probable. This is 265 Front Street. It is a vacant parking lot. And it was going to be rezoned to R6A, basically a 75-foot building. And these were the opponents who occupied 85-foot buildings. They were all affluent, they were mostly white, and they succeeded. So even small scale changes to lots where you wouldn't think, oh, this is a valuable lot, we really need to preserve this lot for a parking lot, get defeated. By contrast, this is how zoning for quality and affordability worked. It was a de Blasio reform in which tiny little changes were made to the zoning code to sort of get rid of obstacles to using available floor area ratio. So the way it would work is essentially you'd say, look, all those areas that were contextually rezoned with an absolute height limit, absolute side yards, let's modify the height limit in the side yards to allow, say, air conditioning and mechanicals to be put up on the roof, or to allow, and this is very effective, bay windows. Bay windows are popular. So you'd add 5 feet here, you'd add 6 feet. You got many more units through zoning and quality affordability because it applied to the entire city. And frankly, most of the NIMBYs couldn't figure out what sort of structure would go nearby that they should oppose. You could also get seniors to back it because it was very useful for getting senior housing into areas where it would otherwise be prohibited by the contextual rezoning limits on structure. So I want to think of this as a citywide strategy, so you don't mobilize a single city council member against it. And the changes that are being proposed are pretty small. Basically, one of the ideas was to elevate the basements by 5 feet so people's windows wouldn't be at foot level, they'd be a little bit higher. You can sell that to the neighborhoods, or get rid of the setbacks on the front so you can allow bay windows. Incidentally, that allows for much more FAR. And in general, create a rule that says if FAR is allowed in this zone, any physical encumbrances in the zoning code get waived. Is there any possibility for a zoning for quality and affordability now for the next mayor? Well, let me just give you a few examples. We need to make the Fetters building buildable again. For those of you who don't know, a Fetters building is a building with a Fetters air conditioning unit that usually has like upwards around 8 units. And it's usually not very attractive. And it's all over Queens. And it's great middle housing. It's also completely unbuildable today. And here are 3 reforms that could make a difference. And the thing I really want to emphasize in closing is stop thinking of density reforms without thinking of the political ramifications. If you suggest a density reform, something to increase housing density, you've got to come with a political bill in hand. Who's going to oppose it? How are you going to outwit them? So one thing you can do is get rid of the parking requirements for duplexes. The second unit in duplexes generates 0.15 cars. And so it might be that you can get rid of that second parking unit which is essentially getting rid of duplexes in zones where duplexes are officially allowed. Another thing you could do is try to trim back in the multiple dwelling unit law that applies to every building over 2 dwelling units. So if you go to a 3rd dwelling unit out in Queens, you got to get put in sprinklers and extra exits because you're treated as a commercial unit under state law. If you trim that back so the 3rd unit doesn't trigger all these onerous obligations, you could build a lot more, duplexes, quadplexes, etc. A third reform, and this I'm trying to just get you into the mindset here, is to extend inclusionary zones all over the city so you can get a small bonus, say from 4 FAR to 4.6 FAR, as long as everything in the extra increment, that bonus, is 100% affordable and permanently affordable. Now, why would that be feasible? Well, because already developers use 420A for 30-year affordable units. If you gave them throughout the city this bonus for 100% affordable, they could put their 421A units in that bonus. And it's very hard for the neighbors to oppose, because who could oppose 100% affordable? Those are the kinds of reforms that have a chance. Will they solve New York's housing crisis? No, they won't. You won't solve that until you change the narrative, empirically disproven, that market rate housing increases rents in nearby housing. But within the confines of that narrative, which has destroyed a housing coalition in New York City, the best I can think is through text-wide, granular text amendments, not map amendments, that outwit the neighbors who will oppose any site-specific large pits battles. Okay, that's all I got to say.
Thank you, Rick, for this very exciting presentation. I would like to now introduce our third panelist, Sean Campion. He's a senior research associate at the Citizen Budget Commission and the author of the August 2020 report titled Strategies to Boost Housing Production in the New York City Metropolitan Area. His research focuses on housing policy, economic development, and municipal finance. Sean, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Solly, and thank you to everyone at NYU for hosting this discussion today. I'll just sort of dive in. I just wanted to give a quick recap of some of the research that we did in the report that you mentioned. I think a lot of this hits on a number of the themes that Rick and Jessica brought up as well. So just sort of to recap, we wanted to look at this question of, why New York City is underproducing housing, particularly relative to other cities of its size. And as Rick mentioned, over the last decade, New York City has built fewer housing units per capita than pretty much every other large and growing city in the US. Not just fast growing cities like Seattle and Austin, but also a lot of the peers that face similar constraints as New York does, like places like Boston, DC, San Francisco. And in a lot of ways, we're closer in terms of our production rate to cities like Philadelphia and Chicago. And it's worth pointing out too that the downstate suburbs, Nassau, Suffolk, and Westchester, are even worse. And this is not a new problem, and in fact, it's probably getting worse over time. New York City has had roughly the same housing growth rate since the 90s, and at least over the last decade, we never even returned to the production level that the city had before the Great Financial Crisis. And we've talked a lot about the results of that already. There's more competition for fewer units. A lot of neighborhoods are actually losing units. We found this in our research, and city planning has put out their own as well. Places like the Upper East Side, the Upper West Side, parts of Brownstone, Brooklyn, even portions of Eastern Queens and Staten Island are actually losing housing units because alterations and combinations of units are outpacing growth. And I suspect that when the new census come out, we'll see some of the results as well in terms of resulting from increased overcrowding, perhaps low vacancy rates, so that's yet to be seen, and a smaller share of units are available to low and moderate income households, both for rent and for home ownership. And what we really wanted to look at CBC was trying to get at some of the reasons why that's the case. And we've hit on a few of them, but sort of go through. So we generally found 4 things. On Rick's point, the first one is that most new development in New York City happens as of right, but there's a limited capacity for as of right development, and it's increasingly limited over time as places that were zoned for growth in recent years, like downtown Brooklyn, the far west side of Manhattan, Long Island City, and the Williamsburg waterfront, are increasingly built out. Some of that is a function of sort of the zoning code itself dating back to 61, but it's also increasingly the result of some of the down zonings that occurred, particularly during the Bloomberg administration. And as a result, most of the city is zoned for relatively low levels of density. 12% of residential lots allow no more than a single family home. About 60% of lots are in the relatively low density zoning districts. And there's also a shortage of development sites, which is partly a function of the zoning, but also a function of what's already built. So only 20% of lots in the city are potential development sites based on sort of the standard methodology the city planning uses for determining what could be redeveloped. And of those, most of those already have some use on them. A lot of them are 1, 2, and 3 family homes. A lot of them are stores. A lot of them are small tenement buildings. So the problem of redevelopment, and also there are very few vacant lots left too. So the problem of redevelopment is that, barring the rezoning of commercial manufacturing land for residential uses, or the creation of new land, which has happened before in the past too, most redevelopment in the city is going to happen through, or most densification is going to happen through redevelopment of existing buildings, which again increases some tensions. The second one is sort of lack of attention to regionalism at the state level. As I mentioned, the downstate suburbs in New York have some of the lowest housing growth rates in the country. And at the state legislative level, there really has been no interest in pursuing strategies to sort of increase production rates in the New York region. As Jessica said, part of the strategy is addressing the question of suburban sprawl. And I think it's important to remember too that housing and job markets are regional in scope, but zoning really happens at the local level. So there's that mismatch is sort of driving some of that gap in the New York region. And New York is blessed with some of the best transit access in the country, and we should be able to use that existing transit networks to help enable some more sustainable growth. But unlike a lot of other states, housing reforms really have not been on the agenda at all in Albany for decades, and weren't even on the agenda at all in this past legislative session. And we had come up with a number of ideas, and I think Furman Center has also put out some great research on ideas that New York State could adapt, drawing from what other states are doing. Looking at sort of New Jersey's, through Mount Laurel, Massachusetts through anti-snob zoning, even places in California where they're trying to streamline development, doing regional housing needs assessments. There are a lot of options out there. But New York is looking at none of them. The third is the high cost of development. Jessica done this with the basement apartment legalization. Rick hit on it with parking. New York is one of the highest cost construction markets in the world. Probably highest in the US behind San Francisco. It's the highest among global cities. And there are a lot of small reasons that add up to why this is the case. A lot of it is in code. Building code influences the materials that get used. For instance, a lot of wood frame construction is banned in New York City. It restricts the ability to use PVC piping for plumbing. There are rules for sprinklers in multifamily dwelling units, as we mentioned. All of those are small things that add up and affect the feasibility of development. There are things like the scaffold law, which increases insurance costs in New York relative to other states. And then there's permitting and regulating issues too. It takes a lot of effort to get even just a regular as-of-right building permit out of Department of Buildings. And to the extent that those process delays add on cost and complexity, dissuades people from coming forward to build. And all those things, reducing the cost of housing makes more development feasible, and also helps on the city side for 100% affordable development, makes it cheaper and requires less subsidy, or to deeper levels of affordability. And the last one I'll just mention briefly is property taxes. The rate on multifamily development in New York City is relatively high. And for years, the real estate industry in particular has contended that new development is not feasible without some form of tax incentive. Largely that's been addressed through the 421A program, which is due to expire next June. And expecting that will probably be a significant fight in the next legislative session over what the future of 421A looks like. And so those are the 4 ideas we've had, and we can sort of get into some in depth as well.
Thank you, Sean. We are now moving to Barika Williams. She's the Executive Director of the Association of Neighborhood and Housing Development, ANHD. ANHD's recent blogs include 220,000 tenants on the brink and counting, and an emerging threat to nonprofit affordable housing. Before joining ANHD, Barika served as the Assistant Secretary for Housing for the state of New York. Thank you, Barika. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you for having me. So as Sally said, my name is Barika Williams. I'm the Executive Director of ANHD. We're a near 50-year affordable housing, community development, and equitable economic development organization, and we span policy, research, advocacy, and community-based organizing, and our members are more than 80 plus neighborhood-based nonprofit organizations across New York City, throughout New York City's neighborhoods, who are working to create more sustainable, safe, and affordable housing and jobs and small business supports in their neighborhoods in the midst of all of this. So I want to talk about a couple of things that are core to ANHD's work, but also have come up in different parts of this conversation, and really understanding that the way that ANHD thinks about this and our years of experience around this is that the supply side of the conversation, which is the center of today's conversation, cannot be divorced from the people side, and the people side is obviously connected to power and to influence, right? And so when we talk about densification, right, development, building in some way, shape, or form, right, what we come back to is really a fundamental question. I think Angela raised in a certain way in the lead-in is, how do we develop without displacement, right? That's one of the key things that we've really been pushing as a conversation. We can't continue to accelerate a conversation around densification and around development and aggressive development if we haven't recognized the displacement and both racial, economic, and cultural displacement that it has been wreaking on particular neighborhoods, specifically BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color neighborhoods, immigrant neighborhoods, and really our low and moderate income neighborhoods in New York City. And so we have to be able to have that conversation as a part of the development conversation and recognize that people are going to have very strong opinions and positions about something that they feel like is changing the fabric of their neighborhood and jeopardizing their home and their community and their stability and their livelihood. I think many of Jessica brought up and Sean brought up much of the data around our rate of development and the city's pace of how much they've been developing. I think one of the interesting things is to pair our overall development rate with some of our other numbers, which is that New York City now for at least 16 years has consistently had the largest, both in terms of cost and numbers, affordable housing plan in the country, right? This is spanning at least 2, if not 3 different mayoral administrations. And despite that, has consistently seen an increase in rent burden and a skyrocketing homelessness number. So despite a large injection of resources and attention to it, there is a piece of and a component of this that we just have to recognize and acknowledge. We have not been able to translate that into a sustainable downward trend of addressing the housing crisis in New York City. And so what I think that presents a particular challenge, if it wasn't intractable enough prior to the past year or two, becomes all the more present right now when we think about sitting on the brink of potentially an eviction tsunami, followed by potentially a foreclosure crisis coming out of COVID, right? And that really is going to depend on our ability to address the millions of New Yorkers who have been unable to pay rent, who are behind in being able to address their mortgage, are going to have to pick up those delayed mortgage payments, and all while still facing a very different economic climate for them and their families. And the levels of unemployment and underemployment are still consistent and extremely high, especially in these most marginalized communities. So one of the things that and for some numbers on that, one of the things that we were looking at is the eviction filings per 1,000 units is upwards around 37 eviction filings per 1,000 residents in some neighborhoods, but down at less than 4 in other parts of core Manhattan, right? So we've got a big spread and a big geographic disparity of how we see this play out. I think the way that we have really approached this is to counter some of the notion of what we need is unfettered and a full release of some of the supply side constraints. One of the challenges that we see in the development conversation and environment is that we fundamentally are sort of backing into what is a trickle-down housing approach. That the assumption is that by releasing supply constraints that really right now are focused on the top end of the market, that we will necessarily build units for the middle and lower income of New Yorkers. Almost half of New Yorkers make less than $75,000 a year as a household. And the vast majority of market rate units in New York City are priced at or above $2,600 for a 2-bedroom apartment. So that is a big disparity in terms of what we are producing, unless it's in the affordable housing pipeline, which Jessica, who we work together all the time, we know that while we are constantly pushing for that, is a relatively small part of that development pie. And so what does that mean when when the supply that currently we're able to produce, limited as it is to some people's data points, is really not aligned with the population, right? And I think that also matters when we're talking about migration and who migrates into New York City, because traditionally the vast majority of inflow to New York City is not high income, right? That might be what we see, that might be what gets captured in narrative, similar to what that Jessica was mentioning around density versus overcrowding. It's like what we see as the narrative is the high income luxury family that is paying, just bought a $5 million condo, but the vast majority of people flowing into New York are often low income immigrant families and individuals who end up in basement apartments, right? For example, as their only form of accessible housing. So I think we really have a fundamental question of the reliance of this trickle down housing approach and how we have been in this system and seen that it's not working for getting us out of our housing crisis. That's why we frame this as we need to prioritize need over numbers, that we need to shift to saying where is there the greatest need? Where can we build to support and stabilize communities so that they then have the ability and access point to move out of systems that maybe have government support or nonprofit support into systems where they can thrive and continue to sustain on their own. I think a part of this has obviously been the rezonings and different rezoning approaches in the different administrations. I would very much counter some of what Roderick Rich framed, that many of the groups that he's suggested were a part of some of these calls, right? CQA, which is zoning for quality and affordability, and mandatory inclusionary housing happened as simultaneous citywide rezonings. And it was I'm not sure that there is such a thing as a technical citywide rezoning that is not an intractable fight at this point in time. Many of us, myself included, were in 13-hour citywide hearings at these various different stages of the process of that getting going, of that moving through. Likewise, Sean is mentioning 421A. That will be, sorry, folks. a very similar dynamic. There's no way to turn it off. And that part of what is coming out is the recognition, the frustration, and really the breaking point of so many communities where they are responsible for taking and owning the vast majority of the city's affordable housing, development, and displacement without having the parallel conversation that this also needs to be happening in wealthy, predominantly white, affluent neighborhoods. There were a number of affordable housing groups who were supportive and spearheaded calling for the rezoning of Soho, NoHo, St. Nick's, Hope, MBD up in Harlem, up in the Bronx, just to name a few. And I don't think it's fair at all to miscategorize and identify communities, especially communities of color, who have been silenced and ignored by the city repeatedly over different rezonings, decision for their own need and for their own good to engage in or speak up on behalf of another rezoning as them being problematic or them being the problem, right? Ultimately, that is a decision that those communities of color especially have to be making about whether or not they are empowering themselves and centering their voices, or if they are being used or utilized for a political agenda. I think so. I think that that's a piece that really has to be raised and pulled apart. And I think, you know, I understand the concept of, you know, figuring out how to find a way to get rezoning or density through the development or land use process in a way that people will not realize it. But I fundamentally think that that's flawed. The problem is that the people who benefit and advance and end up with the outputs that they want from our current land use process are our most affluent and resourced communities. And if we continue to make this process one that benefits those who can maneuver, have the resources, the wherewithal, the time to maneuver through a land use process or a development process, it will just further exacerbate these disparities. And what we're seeing now is that people are just frustrated. They're tired of this setup where things are being pushed through, especially communities of color. And I think we've really got to think about whether or not we're coming to a bit of a logjam where we're going to come to a grinding halt in terms of development moving forward because we've reached an intractable political dynamic, or if we're going to actually step back and have a conversation of what each and every community, affluent, not affluent, communities of color, non-communities of color, immigrant communities, trans communities, are responsible for in our development framework and part of the affordable housing solution, and ensure that they are both empowered to be a part of that process, and that our politicians have the responsibility to follow through and make good on spreading that commitment across communities with the understanding of how this has been so uneven and so unequal for the decades that we have been doing this.
Thank you, Barika. These are very important issues, and I'll definitely like to come back to them during the discussion. Our final panelist is Henry Graber. He's a staff writer at Slate, writing on urban issues. His latest articles include "City councils are the real villains of the housing crisis." Henry Graber is a journalist who writes about architecture, real estate, transportation, and the environment. Henry, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sully. I was really pleased to hear Rick mention parking requirements. As someone who's writing a book about parking. It is shocking that New York City still requires parking as a component of new housing anywhere in the 5 boroughs, especially when it's such a major impediment to affordability, and we're trying to get people out of their cars in the first place. I'm hoping that what I'm going to talk about, which is the structure of the city council and how it relates to development, will tie up a bit of Rick's focus on thinking citywide with what Barika is saying about the observation of who has been winning from the way development has been happening over the last 10 years and the inequalities that have resulted from that. And the subject I want to talk about today specifically is member deference, which is the policy in the city council where individual council members have total power over development that happens in their neighborhoods, which means in this case, both proper rezonings, but also individual projects that go through the ULURP process. This is a structural problem that is not unique to New York. It's the situation in most large American cities. Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, all have some version of this. We can understand where this comes from. It grows out of the 50s and 60s and a reaction to top-down urban renewal projects. And the sense was that by decentralizing authority and putting local city council members in charge of what's going on in their neighborhoods, we could get more equitable results. But I don't think that's the case. I think that the way that redevelopment has happened in New York City demonstrates that the rezonings tend to happen in Black neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy or Latino neighborhoods like Williamsburg, whereas white neighborhoods, especially in the city's more outer, more suburban neighborhoods, have managed to downzone themselves and keep development out. So I think people also often say that the problem here is NIMBYism, but I would suggest that there is a kind of structural prisoner's dilemma at play where we all think that the city could use a little more housing, but there is really no incentive to be the council person who puts their hand up and says, we'll go first. And this is, I think one of the reasons for this is that there are concentrated drawbacks to accepting a rezoning and accepting all this new development. There's a lot of development pressure. So the minute you open up the zoning envelope, you're going to see a lot of construction. Neighbors are going to be mad about the construction. There may be more kids in the schools, more pressure on the local transportation system. Parking, of course, is an issue. Whereas the benefits from allowing that development are more diffuse. They're citywide, right? Which is contributions to the tax base, to the growth of the housing stock, simply the more general civic idea that we should create more room for people to live in New York City. And those are really diffuse. So I can understand why individual city council members don't want to step up here. And all this is magnified when you start talking about affordable housing, about shelters. This policy of deference is basically a license for various city council members to discriminate and say, no, I don't want housing shelter in my neighborhood. And the policy is that the whole city council will just say, all right, well, they made that call and that's what we're going to go with. There is some great data on this out of Chicago, which has different issues from New York, but has a very similar policy. There they call it Aldermanic Privilege. And the result there is that 98% of affordable housing in Chicago gets built in majority minority wards. And that is because white aldermen will not allow it in their neighborhoods. I imagine that if somebody were to undertake something similar in New York, looking at where low-income housing gets built, you would see something similar. So there's actually a kind of interesting ideological coalition for trying to address this issue. AOC has said that she has asked on her questionnaire for city council candidates whether they would support ending member deference for affordable housing. Andrew Yang has talked about it. In Chicago, Lori Lightfoot made it sort of the central plank of her campaign, although she failed to get it done. I think there's this sort of recognizes the problem. People are sort of getting onto this. One of the problems is segregation, which you see in Chicago. except when it happens through gentrification, where you have white people moving into upzoned majority minority neighborhoods. Another problem is low housing growth, because this creates all these obstacles where to get something built, you have to go through a specific city council member. So that, that's true for both rezonings and for the ULURP process. But I think that, that means that mega projects that can bother to seek the ULURP process or find it worthwhile to engage with a local city council member and go through the process are more likely to get built than the type of, missing middle infill housing that's more likely to provide affordable units. I think when you look at development in New York City, you see that the projects get bigger and bigger. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we've zoned out a lot of this missing middle as of right development, where we might find naturally occurring affordable housing in neighborhoods of the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island. The other thing is corruption, right? By putting individual council members in charge of everything that happens in their district, you create an opportunity for, or you basically tell developers, here's where you go with your money to get your project built. And we see that all the time, where council members are sort of funding their campaigns with real estate donations. And that's not an accident. Giving them veto power over all these projects in their neighborhoods makes them a natural focal point for these donations. And then the final one I would say is low trust in government, because when you have basically a pretty strict zoning envelope, and then you have local council members in charge of granting exemptions to that. I've talked to people about this in my own reporting, and I also think there's some studies to back this up. It encourages the perception that developers don't play by the rules, because city council members are always granting exemptions. And then this creates a sort of vicious cycle where city council members then support stricter and stricter zoning because it gives them the power to bargain away those rules. And I'll just conclude on that note and say that if we're thinking about how to alleviate this issue, it's complicated because it's not a rule, right? It's just a custom. And so you need council members to get up and say, we're going to stop abiding by this rule when it comes to affordable housing. We're going to overrule local council members when it comes to building 100% affordable housing in neighborhood X or neighborhood Y. We consider that a citywide priority. And I think that would be a place to start. But again, it's not something that a mayor could undo by fiat, right? I mean, it's a custom that's long established. And I would almost say it's sort of built into the way our system is constructed.
Thank you, Henry. This brings to a close the panelists' presentations. I would like now to invite my colleague Alain Berthaud to sum up and comment on these presentations before we open the floor for an exchange among the panelists. Alain, please.
Thank you. Well, listening to this panel, I feel it's a very bleak picture of what is happening. There is on one hand, it seems a general opposition to any new supply of housing. And on the other hand, there is also a regulatory straitjacket, which has been built over the years, which are incredibly intricate. I mean, the description of Jessica of what will allow a basement apartment to be legalized is absolutely mind-boggling. And the combination of those two effects are absolutely, I would say I've been a bit overwhelmed by the different participation here. What is interesting is that the panel take slightly different, let's say, either segment of the market or aspect of the malfunction of the city. Barika maybe has the approach which is more centers on the low-income people who are mostly the victims of the system, actually. And and in a way, she described a situation when, because of the lack of transparency on the way decisions are taken, there is a general suspicion that anything will change will be at the detriment of the people who they serve the most. This type of situation is, frankly, I don't know how to summarize all that and to get a conclusion. You know, I have to confess, maybe I was the wrong person here to be the discussant. I'm a bit overwhelmed by it. I understand our former director, Paul Romer, who confronted with the problem of the city, wanted to create a shorter city where you will start from scratch, with a tabula rasa. This is not, of course, a possibility. New York will never be a tabula rasa. So how do we start reform? How do we build a coalition? It seems that now practically all the coalitions are working against any change, either as Barika described it, because of suspicion that any change will be at their detriment, or or because they think they will be a disbenefit, a negative externality on any change. So in a way, we are confronted to an extremely conservative city, and a city thrives on change. If you compare what New York City is now compared to what it was, say, 50 years ago, it has changed a lot, and that was part of its success. If it cannot change, if now we have reached a system where everything is frozen, then I wonder, frankly, what is the future of New York City? I'm sorry to have a very, very negative attitude like that. I'm normally an optimist, but I work worldwide, and therefore cities compete with each other. And when a city is dysfunctional, people vote with their feet and leave. And I wonder if maybe one day New York will not have reached this point. I remember, the political aspect also is a bit depressing. I remember the president of the European Commission one day, which says, we know what to do it right. We don't know how to be reelected after we have done the right thing. And I think that this is, again, a problem. I think that Henry described that relatively well. Again, the political problem of the structure we have created. What is even more disturbing, but what Henry described, is that apparently it is based on tradition more than law. So even if you change, the mayor could not change this tradition. So again here, I'm a bit at a loss of making let's say, I would have tried to have an optimistic view of, we have 2 or 3 solutions here. I'm sure they will emerge eventually from dialogue like that. We probably should have more, but I'm completely unable to be optimistic after what I hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Alain, for this very depressing conclusion. I'm not sure that we have to stay there. I agree that a year and a half of COVID, it does not improve your mood, but we are facing a new administration. There will be room for new ideas, and I would hope for some experiments in trying to start something new without a kind of a major overhaul or a major revision. And what I'm looking for are like these small changes that that can get things moving. Even China, which is a much more autocratic and highly centralized and regulated, allows its cities to experiment. And that's how they learn. They allow some cities to take different ways without conforming to the general rules. And if it works, they apply it to the country as a whole. If it doesn't, they kind of have a punitive attitude toward the city for breaking the rules. But at least we should be allowed to experiment and to try out some of the things. I was fascinated by what Barika was saying, for example, that what she would like is to empower communities of color to be able to do, to produce affordable housing. I think that this is fine. I would be completely for that because I believe that the people who are there can build more housing and can improve the housing that they have with assistance, but without overpowering them. And that I would be all for that, and I can see a lot of opportunity for that. The question is, how do we start the ball rolling in that direction? I would like to open the floor for panelists to comment on what was said by any one of the participants thus far, and to start a discussion. Does anyone want to start?
Sure, I'll get started. I just want to follow up a little bit on what Henry and Roderick talked about, and also try to pivot us maybe a little bit to a more optimistic place. It's beautiful weather out today, so I'm still feeling like New York is the greatest city in the world, despite a lot of our challenges. I think some glimmer of everything, that it's a correct characterization to say we are in a bit of a stalemate at this point, and there's a lot of reason to be pessimistic. That said, I do see a lot of silver linings. One, for example, is CHPC typically doesn't get involved in particular neighborhood rezonings. We have done so this year, and Soho in particular. And one of the reasons why we have is because that process has been really emblematic of the change that we need to go through and that we are going through in the land use conversations in New York. So there were many community organizations that were not based in Soho that did weigh in on the Soho rezoning to try to support it. And that's going to continue over the course of the ULURP from all across the city. That's new. That's a real change. That's a real shift in dynamic that we're seeing in the Soho rezoning, where finally here's an opportunity to talk about how neighborhoods are related in each other, how preserving Soho and Amber for 40 years has had these knock-on effects across the city. So we see CDCs in Brooklyn saying, maybe we wouldn't have gentrified as much over the past 30 years if you had built sufficient housing in these core Manhattan neighborhoods, so people could have stayed there, and then they wouldn't have started exploring in Fort Greene and in Bed-Stuy and keep kind of pushing out and out and out. So there are good reasons why those organizations, despite that it's very rare for neighborhood organizations to kind of weigh in on places outside their catchment area. So that's been kind of a glimmer of hope for me. I also think that this conversation around, when is it neighbor, I think this is playing out in Soho too. When is it neighborhood self-determination and kind of community input and asking the community what they want? And when is it exclusion? I think those are really hard questions to answer. We've avoided asking them in New York for a long time. And now here we are really being able to have these conversations about, can we use colorblind language to talk about racial segregation in New York City? Can we start saying the community and mean one thing when we say Staten Island and mean another thing when we say East New York, and just sort of use that kind of euphemisms? And I think we're starting to see past that a bit, which I think is in a positive note. Most of my career has been in supportive housing, and we've had a really strong ground game in supportive housing, getting support for projects bit by bit by bit. And that's been something that those organizations have had, both the burden, but also developed a really great skill set in making that happen. And I think what we're seeing in some of these fights on the Upper West Side, all over town about homeless shelters, is like, when is my opinion about what should happen in my neighborhood? When does that get superseded by the needs of 60,000 homeless people to have a roof over their heads? For the first time, we saw a strong community coalition on the Upper West Side come out in favor of a homeless shelter. So I think that process we've seen go forward. I'll also add that virtual community engagement may may be a good ingredient towards that as well. Since we've started this kind of Zoom era of community engagement, I've seen people coming into a community board meeting while waiting in the waiting room of the dentist's office office, while cooking their kids dinner, while driving home from school. These are all people who were not going to be able to sit for 8 hours in the basement of a middle school waiting to their turn to speak 2 minutes. They may not be part of an, have time to be part of an organized group that gets the matching t-shirts and goes out and does demonstrations day after day, but they wanted to spend 5 minutes saying what they cared about and what they needed for their neighborhood. And I think that's been a really positive. So those are my high notes for land use in New York City these days.
Thank you, Jessica. I think you are completely in the right in saying, when should members decide? And I completely agree with what you said and what Henry said, that when it comes to affordable housing, there has to be a fair share rule. And that is, all communities have to do affordable housing. That's not up to them. And then what is up to them is what they're going to do about it, but not whether they're going to do it or not.
Yeah,
I want to invite other people to comment.
Yeah, Solly, on that point, there's a difference between a normative statement, as you know, and a predictive statement. Of course, New York would love to have fair share, but the problem is that in order to do that, you'd have to break the power of member privilege. You'd have to break none of the people who are replacing Margaret Chin, for instance, in Soho, are supporting the Soho rezoning. There's 8 candidates vying for her seat. None of them are supporting that rezoning. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that the narrative, even in rich areas, that market rate housing somehow displaces people is overwhelmingly dominant, despite the overwhelming empirical evidence that market rate housing lowers nearby rents. There is zero evidence that new market rate housing increases rents. And yet that narrative means it's very hard to merit it. That narrative that somehow new market rate housing will increase rents makes it very hard to mobilize a cross-city coalition to say to the representative from Soho, we're going to vote against you. You need to have citywide political parties that had a pro-supply agenda. Here's something that I just cannot communicate. It's not being communicated, and I blame no one for the failure to communicate it. Wealthy white people are shunting other wealthy white people into neighborhoods with affordable housing, bidding up the units in those neighborhoods. Those Feder buildings that I described, their rents are rapidly escalating. Why? Because new housing is not built on 265 Front Street. But the consciousness that what happens in Soho will bid up the prices in Crown Heights is not mobilizing a cross-city coalition. And I know there were some pro-housing groups that got involved in Soho. I am very pessimistic about Soho. It's in Judge Engeron's hands right now, and he is accepting arguments about procedure that I think will certainly doom that zoning. I'm writing an amicus brief, I'll do my best, but I just do not see, for instance, the Fifth Avenue Committee involved. They filed an amicus brief in Gowanus. They're not involved. Why? They got no skin in that game. Now, I'm not blaming anyone. Barika says suggests I'm blaming anyone. No, the people I blame are people like me, because somehow we can't communicate to the people who care about gentrification that what's going on when a wealthy white neighborhood excludes new market rate housing is that's going to affect them in Inwood or East New York or Sunnyside. We're not communicating that. And so the people aren't showing up. I am extremely pessimistic that there will be any large scale change. I think some of my small scale changes can be smuggled by. I know lawyers in planning who think they can be smuggled by, but they're not gonna make a giant difference. So increase some of the duplexes, quadplexes, we get us a little bit FAR, but that's what we're looking at. And I just don't see a solution to it.
I just, I want to speak on that because I don't feel like what you're giving is a fair characterization for those communities and those organizations, intelligence, awareness, capacity, and strategy. So yeah, so ANHD gave direct technical assistance to almost every single one of these neighborhood rezonings. Gowanus, East New York, Inwood, up in Kingsbridge, right, East Harlem. There were a number of us who mobilized around and a philanthropy community who supported investing in those communities, having the resources necessary to engage in their rezoning process. And some of them actually came to a place of proactively creating their own pro-development agenda that increased density, increased development, resulted in more housing, but ultimately was rejected by the administration. And that's Bushwick, and Lower East Side Chinatown, both who had their own development plans and agendas, and that the administration failed and refused to embrace them, right? In the construct of Soho NoHo, I think what it's not that those communities don't see Soho NoHo as relevant and as a part of their fight. And it really feels like you're dismissing and diminishing their understanding of the current framework and environment. Many of those groups are the people who have been leading the call for upzoning, density, affordable housing, and more of a fair share approach to development in the city consistently for decades. We've been the people saying to the city, why is this only being turned to and looked at for communities of color and low income communities? Moses Gates with Regional Plan Association wrote a piece years ago saying, here are 10 neighborhoods that have transit access, that have available city-owned land that could be densified, and none of them were on the list of a potential neighborhood rezone, right? So I think what is not being appreciated here is also understanding that these are limited groups who are responding to, they're doing COVID response. These are the same groups who have to enroll all thousands of their tenants in rent, in an emergency rental assistance. They've been feeding their communities throughout this. And now a city administration 7 years in is finally considering and finally talking about rezoning an affluent white neighborhood, and wants all of us to drop our work and get behind them when they've spent the past 7 years refusing to listen to us call for our own demands. The decision of how we want to engage in that is our own agency and our own political calculation. And we should have the right to do that the same way these other communities do. So I don't feel like it's fair to disparage those community groups, because they are exercising their political power by potentially sitting something out. Does it have ramifications? Would we all like to see Soho NoHo go through? In many ways, I can't speak for everybody, but I think a lot of us would. I know Jessica has been one of the people leading on this, but that is not the same thing as saying, I now have to respond to a city government who has refused to listen to my needs, my voice, and my ask for the past 40 some odd years.
Yeah, just let me, on a point of clarification, I am not disparaging these community groups. I tried to be clear in saying I'm disparaging people like myself and de Blasio who have failed to build this coalition. By no means am I saying, oh, well, an anti-gentrification group in East New York, bad anti-gentrification, you should show up at Soho. Not at all. What I am saying is, despite the participation of various interests in these kinds of rezonings, they're not happening, they're not going to happen, and it's going to hurt the poor. Whose fault is that? It's the fault of the people who need to build coalitions. I call them politicians. We need politicians who can build coalitions. Now, I just want to highlight California YIMBY here, and especially Daryl Owens in Oakland. He has succeeded in building a cross coalition with, for instance, BLM activists, anti-gentrification activists, and YIMBY activists. So I see that this is possible. It is not happening in New York City. And I just don't see that. And therefore, I think there's a problem. And I think you're right to identify the problem with the politicians, not with the activists. So I just want to highlight that. The idea that I'm disparaging community groups is an idea I want to reject. But I am disparaging a political system that cannot build a consistent and powerful coalition. An example, Ocasio-Cortez is clearly a leader of a sort of New York progressive group with Jimmy Van Brandt and a few other council people. How hard have they pushed for the Soho rezoning?
I'm going to jump in there. Though. I really do see some glimmers of hope here. A lawsuit right now on procedural grounds is totally par for the course. We see it every time. We worked it out in Gowanus. We'll work it out in Soho. I'm not so afraid of that.
You did not work out in Gowanus. Catherine Levine has not settled that one. And I think
we did a hybrid hearing last week. It was fine. It'll be fine. There's at least 2 council members running in that district who are in favor of the Soho rezoning. And the reason why I'm not worried about it is that the lawsuit can postpone this all they want, but virtually every mayoral candidate who's running right now in a very heated race where I'm sure they would all love to peel off a couple votes in Soho have all also said, regardless of what their geographic base is, said that they're in favor of it. So there's really not going to be a lot of benefit, I don't think, to the Soho opponents of pushing this back a year if they manage to succeed even in doing that. So I'm pretty optimistic about it, I'll say.
I also, sorry, to go back to this, but
I just want to ask whether Henry or Sean want to put in a word before giving the floor back to you.
I'll say, I'll let Barika talk first and then I'll chime in.
it's all right, Sean. Do you want to go?
No, go, finish your thought.
I mean, I also think the other piece that folks, you know, there's definitely problems and faults with our political system in many different ways and places, as Henry has done work on and others have done work on as well. But I don't think that that's the same thing as saying that politicians who should be engaged in a certain way are not engaged, right? I also think we've got to consider that just because it seems like the fight we in any given moment in time, myself, you, Rich, any of us on here want them to engage in, does not mean it's necessarily where they are putting their weight or where we as a community, as a strategy, are putting our weight, right? So would I want those state and city and federal elected officials to be redirecting their attention to Soho, NoHo, and us potentially have a weaker, less equitable emergency rental assistance program? No. A lot of us put a ton of effort over the last few months, really laser focused on making sure that we got provisions that ensured that we could reach basement apartment tenants, that ensured that we could reach immigrant and undocumented immigrant populations, that ensured that, right? So these are different pieces. And I think we've got to appreciate that there are any number of things happening across the housing landscape. And all of us have to recognize that we have a certain amount of political capital and currency to put into this. So simultaneous to this conversation, fresh off the presses today, is a brand new piece of legislation that hopefully will get voted on in the city council in the coming couple of weeks that requires a racial impact study and analysis that looks at displacement pressures, racial and cultural displacement indicators, and manufacturing potential displacement as a course of action, so that we are actually able to have informed discussions about this going forward, as opposed to having to generate and create it every single time. So I think there's also a piece of like where what we're choosing to get behind in certain moments and what needs to be the focus, and we might not always all agree on what that is.
Thank you. Thank you, Barika. I do agree with you on the point that the approach, and I think Rick spoke about it, is kind of more like citywide guerrilla warfare approach to doing many things at the same time, maybe small things, rather than focusing on one particular battle. And I think that is the correct approach. I wanted to ask Henry or Sean again whether they would like to comment.
Yeah, so I was going to tie this back to the debate over comprehensive planning. I think a lot of these threads come into that too. You know, a lot of these problems, question of, you know, which neighborhoods do or don't get rezoned, largely come down to leadership. I think a lot of the resistance from the, you know, not only this administration, but past administrations, the idea of comprehensive planning is that it's big, it's messy, it's complicated, and they're going to choose their political fights on certain neighborhoods where they can actually get things through. And a lot of that is stuff that's evolved as custom. It's not necessarily in law. You know, there's no law that says the member deference exists. It's purely a custom of the council, and one that didn't really exist until recent years. I mean, going back to the 90s after charter reform, you know, the council passed a number of rezonings, you know, where the, you know, individual council member didn't support it. And, you know, a lot of the question of, you know, whether we move through on comprehensive planning is, you know, the idea of whether an administration can sort of establish there's a citywide need and figure out how to allocate that down to neighborhoods, but also have neighborhoods participate in planning. And a lot of the pushback on comprehensive planning is, one is, whether it's going to create a huge new bureaucracy on the environmental review side, which is sort of the city's argument, and on the neighborhood side of that they don't want that growth. And the question is how you allocate that, and that's it's political. There's clearly a need. I think we had called for a need for better planning that prioritizes growth and sort of evenly or distributes it somewhat equitably across the city. But that's largely a political fight, and it's there's really no way to legislate that other than sort of having an administration who sort of sets goals and is willing to implement it.
Well, I would like to suggest one way that we maybe could. I think as I've expressed, I think there are structural problems with the city council, and I think Jessica makes a great point that it's not, we can't talk about empowerment or decentralization in general terms, because neighborhoods in New York City are not created equal. They don't have equal needs, and they don't have equal responsibilities to bear the weight of new facilities like homeless shelters. I would like to propose one thing that we haven't talked about today, which is override from Albany. We have a very progressive state Senate, and we have a Democratic supermajority. Several other states where city councils have suffered from the types of structural problems that I've talked about have seen progressive policy come down from the state level. For example, California has the affordable housing streamlining bill that Rick mentioned. And I see no reason why we couldn't see something similar come down from Albany. There is no reason New York City should still have parking requirements. There is no reason New York City should have a single neighborhood that does not permit duplexes, triplexes, or fourplexes. There's no reason that New York City should require any kind of permission at all for small infill affordable housing. So that's stuff that could be solved tomorrow in Albany. And I just haven't heard anybody really talk about it. So I would say one solution to dealing with the gridlock at the city level is just don't do it at the city level, do it at the state level.
Thank you, Henry, for this comment. I think you are right on. I just want to mention that there is a law that in Albany right now for accessory dwelling units, and it's likely to pass. It's in committee right now, and it's likely to pass, and that would create opportunities for many of the neighborhoods that we've been talking about to start both legalizing basement apartments and adding granny flats or converting garages to apartments. And that could happen, and it could happen at the state level and kind of be brought down to the city from there. Rick, were you going to make another comment?
Just beware of Albany. The two greatest impediments to housing in New York City are the 12 FAR limit and the multiple dwelling law. Those are crippling to housing supply, and they come straight from Albany. So yes, there's a small incipient open New York movement, a couple of members. I'm not optimistic about how the ADU bill, if passed, will be implemented. An ADU bill was passed in California. Nothing happened for more than a decade until bill after bill was passed forcing recalcitrant communities to accept granny flats. So although I understand the state has the power, the notion that the state is going to use that power on behalf of, well, opponents to wealthy homeowners strikes me as optimistic.
Alain, would you like to make another comment?
So trying to be optimistic after what just Henry said.
That's your last chance.
Or Rick say, I tell you, I think that at a certain time, somebody, what Rick proposed to have small change in the zoning, which are not very spectacular, but if you calculate the geometry, that could change things. That seems maybe the most likely thing to happen, probably. We will have to monitor to see if, what in the long run, how many new units it provides. But I think that in a way, Yeah, I don't see, normally in a city, I will propose a general audit of regulations and get rid of the one where we cannot understand why they were there. For instance, what Jessica was talking about in the basement, there are a number of regulations. Some you understand it's okay, it's for fire, fine. But others, you have no idea what they are there. And to do an audit will say, well, if we don't know why this regulation is here, let us remove it. So that's what I call an audit. Unfortunately, in the case of New York, and again, maybe even the complexity of having Albany and New York City at the same time having their own vested interest, I think we have put ourselves in again in a straitjacket, and we cannot escape from that. But again, I would like, and then of course there is let's say the very different communities which are living in New York City and which have a history of discrimination doesn't facilitate the dialogue, let's face it, because there is not much confidence. And I think Barika explained that very well. And, this is a fact. So it's, let's say, again, I like to be optimistic. I'm very impressed by the knowledge and the determination of the panelists. I hope that they succeed. But again, don't forget that cities compete with each other. If New York do not solve their problem, one day it will be seen in in the productivity of the city, and people will vote with their feet.
Thank you, Alain. Unfortunately, unless there is a panel, does any of the panelists want to make another 30-second comment? I have time for that, and then I'm going to close the panel. Barika, would you like to make a short comment?
Sure. I mean, I think to Alain's point, and I think the great thing about this conversation is one of the things that we need to really acknowledge is in New York City is that we don't have a solution to this. If we recognize and acknowledge that we have across different people in different positions, the agreed understanding that we need development, that we need affordable housing, we need to address the housing crisis and the homelessness crisis, that we have a political system that isn't working for moving this forward equitably, and that communities don't have access and voice. We know that all of those are the problem points. We might not all agree on the solutions, but at least let's engage in a really robust conversation on starting to figure them out, as opposed to operating in this denial fashion that we have the solutions now and we can just continue to plug ahead as we have been and maybe tinker around the edges. It's not going to get us there.
I think this is very well said, Barika, and I think that realizing that we're stuck is the precondition for figuring out a way to get unstuck. Jane, would you like to make a 30-second, I'm sorry, Jessica, would you like to make a 30-second closing statement, please?
Sure. So I think one of the factors that we've been looking at is like this, like Barika was talking about, the kind of sticking with the same old tools or trying not to do that anymore, is around this idea of the unit counting as being our measure of what a housing plan is for New York City. That's like a really strong management tool for the city agencies, but it's not a housing policy, and it doesn't begin to start to describe what housing policy can do. And as Barika said, we're not more affordable than we were before we started these ever more ambitious plans. So while building new units and finding a good way to track them is really critical, I think that we've got to certainly find new ways to talk about who is this for, why are we doing this, where are we doing it, and really extend the conversation beyond just the kind of raw numbers, because it doesn't work as a policy matter and it definitely doesn't work as a communication strategy.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm sorry that I have to, our time is up and I have to bring this panel to a close. I want to, first of all, thank everybody for their participation and for their ability to articulate their views, and also for their actual work on the ground in New York City to get us closer to solving this intractable problem. Again, I thank the participants and the audience who joined us for today. Let me just say in closing that this is the last of our seminars, 4 webinars on the anatomy of density. It concludes this set. We have another set of webinars in the making that will be will take place in the fall. Starting in September, there will be 4 webinars on the issue of urban expansion, which is kind of the complementary way of making room in cities for their growth. That would be undertaken together with a special issue on urban expansion in a journal called Buildings and Cities. We will keep you informed, and we would like you, of course, all to join us back after you take a good summer vacation and get some relaxation from over Zooming during this pandemic. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope to keep in touch. Goodbye.